Welcome to the Healthy Relationships Initiative podcast. Our goal is to provide information and tools to help you build happier, healthier, and safer relationships of all kinds. To learn more about HRI, please visit www.guilfordhri.org and check us out on social media at guilfordhri.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's Healthy Relationships Initiative Relationships Booster. Our topic today is supporting a partner who has a history of trauma. The Healthy Relationships Initiative is a partnership between UNC Greensboro and the Phillips Foundation, and our mission is to promote happy, healthy, and safe relationships of all kinds in Guilford County and beyond. We invite you to check out our website at guilfordhri.org to learn more about the initiative and find a lot of online resources that we have available. And we'd love for you to connect with us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter at guilfordhri. I just wanted to cover a few quick details before we get started today. First of all, we really encourage you to make use of the chat room. You're able to submit questions at any time, and all of those questions will be submitted anonymously. And the best way to submit them is by sending them to Camilla, who is going to be our moderator for today. As you saw when you logged in, or the information that we sent out, we encourage people to use an anonymous username just in case it shows up somewhere with your questions. But we do encourage you to also share your feedback with us. We'd love to hear, before you sign off at the end, we'll share the link for a feedback form because we're always looking to continuously improve these programs. So we'll go ahead and get started with today's program. Again, the topic for today's program is supporting a partner with a history of trauma. My name is Christine Murray, and I'm a professor at UNC Greensboro in the Department of Counseling and Educational Development, and I coordinate the Couple and Family Counseling track. And I'm also the director of the Healthy Relationships Initiative. And today we've got our featured expert with us, who is Joy Kelly. And she is a doctoral candidate, and it should say a very soon-to-be doctoral graduate because she's going to be receiving her doctoral degree and has defended her dissertation and completed all the requirements in just a couple weeks, and she is also a therapist at Family Solutions. So welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, for having me.
And Joy, could you share just a little bit about some of your background experiences and especially why this topic is something that's of interest to you?
Absolutely. So I want to backtrack just a little bit in terms of what got me interested in this field in counseling. I've been at UNC Greensboro for quite a while. I actually did my undergraduate studies here in business studies and dance, actually. So I have a very different background professionally. Moved to New York after graduation, thought I wanted to make a career in business and integrate dance within that, but that ended up not being the case. And did a lot of soul searching, actually started my own counseling. And one of the reasons that kind of drew me into that, along with wanting to pursue this career change, kind of always knowing that I had a passion for helping others, but really not listening to that, was really my own experiences of trauma in a relationship. And so that has been a personal and professional driver for me at this point in my career. So I came back to graduate school to earn my master's in 2014 here in the CED department here at UNC Greensboro. Was a couple and family track major, and so really enjoyed that experience there, but was really just interested in learning more about, how I can best utilize my passions, and so wanted to get interested and began applying for that PhD degree so I could be able to teach and research and, really kind of capitalize on those passions that I had. So the three-year-long journey started in 2016, and so I'm kind of at the end of that journey now. It's been challenging and very, I'm so glad that I was able to pursue that. And so, as you said, I am also a therapist at Family Solutions currently. I've been there for almost 2 years now. Started in 2016, going into 2017. So really my caseload there, I love working with women and adults, obviously survivors of domestic violence is my personal interest. I also see couples. I have a few kids on my caseload as well, so I really enjoy my ability to continue practice and work with this population, and especially those who have been affected by trauma.
Great, and I think you didn't mention in the midst of all of that, that also your dissertation study was about survivors of abuse.
Yes, my study that I was able to conduct, it was an instrument development study actually, that really looks at the strengths-based outcomes of healing and growth and recovery in the long term for survivors of domestic violence. So I'm really excited about that study and hope to get it published and continue work on it as something that's really passionate for me.
Well, and I just think that one of the things I really appreciate about you, and I think that you're going to bring to our discussion today, is just how you weave together the personal experiences with the counseling experience and the research, and so you'll definitely have a lot of insights to share.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so, yeah.
So we're going to just dive right in then and talk about supporting a partner. You start with an introduction to this topic of supporting a partner who has a history of trauma. And as we're starting, I definitely want to mention that this is definitely a topic that could be emotionally difficult for people who are listening or who are part of our live program today. So we definitely want to encourage each of you to take good care of yourselves as we're discussing these. Do what you need to do to practice self-care, and just understand that these are topics that are very natural for emotional responses to happen. So along those lines then, let's kind of our first question.
Right.
Why is it that people who have a past history of trauma might experience a lot of different emotional reactions and just be affected so deeply by those traumatic experiences?
Absolutely. Well, I think, Dr. Murray, first of all, you already hit the nail on the head in terms of describing that this is a very normal reaction to the brain's way of coping with something that has been very hard, very negative, that has impacted the person. Those experiences are unique and can range depending on the person. So sometimes whenever we think of trauma, we think that it has to be some, huge event that, that anyone would experience as distressing, and that's not always the case. And so I think it's important for people to know that it's normal for the body to have reactions to things that have been hard for them. The brain kind of has a way of kind of encoding these reminders. So when people say triggers or having a large emotional response, that's the brain's way of remembering, what's happened to that person and the emotional response that was related to that event. And so when we're out in the world, even if we're not, even if there's not really a real threat to us, that there's something that comes up and we are reminded of that, our body sometimes kind of automatically goes back to that place. So it's a perfectly normal reaction. Some people obviously don't like having those reactions, but, there are ways to work through it. And, it really goes back to whenever our body, our emotions don't feel safe. And so whenever that system is threatened, right, and we feel unsafe or we feel fearful or anxious about something based on the trauma that's happened to us, we can have this trigger or this emotional response that kind of carries over. In the short term, in the long term, it just really depends on what it is and how that individual person experienced it.
And so it makes sense then, because this is a really emotional experience for people who go through a trauma, that those effects can last for a long time, which speaks to the importance of what we're talking about today, because it could be years later and somebody is still dealing with some of those emotions. So, but let's back up just a little bit. So we know that these are really intense emotional experiences. But what is a trauma? What are some of the examples of types of experiences that somebody could have that would be considered traumatic?
Absolutely. So really trauma is a word that we really use to describe any type of strong emotional response that someone has to an event that they may experience as negative, adverse, and causes a lot of distress. So that can mean a lot of different things for different people. Sometimes the automatic things that I think a lot of our society thinks about are things like war, combat, the historical context of even what post-traumatic growth, which is the disorder that we use to describe people that have active trauma symptoms, actually came from soldiers who were coming back from the war in the military. So that's kind of how we got that language in the first place. But people can experience trauma in lots of different ways. And so a car accident, a natural disaster like an earthquake or a flood, and even smaller things that may happen. You know, sometimes people describe, you know, getting up in front of a room and having to do a speech and being really embarrassed, or maybe something happened associated, and that can be traumatic for some people. Some of the things that we're talking about today, domestic violence, if you've experienced an assault or abuse of any kind, these are things that can also be traumatic. So there's really a spectrum and a range of experiences. It doesn't just have to be that. It's just based on how that person experiences that event and to what level it is still affecting them.
And so we know, too, along those lines, like you said, there's a real spectrum of the types of experiences. So things could be somewhat less severe or really severe, but we can't always tell just based on how objectively severe something appears, how somebody's going to perceive that, because there's a lot of things that really influence the impact that a trauma has for somebody.
Right.
And one of those things is whether it occurs in the context of a relational situation.
Yes.
And so that any type of trauma could potentially impact somebody in the context of a future close relationship.
Yes.
But let's talk for a minute about traumas that occur in a relational context, like domestic violence or child abuse, and what makes those traumatic experiences different from, say, a natural disaster.
Right. Well, when we're talking about a relationship-based trauma, a lot of the times, and I'm not saying that this happens all the time, but a lot of the times in the context of something like child abuse or sexual abuse or domestic violence, a lot of the times the violence is occurring in the context with someone, with an intimate person in the person's life, where there's a level of trust, love, and connection and care for. So, you know, our interpretations of what happens with that person can become much more complicated because, right, we're supposed to love and care about this person. How can a person who's supposed to love me, care about me, maybe it's a family member, a friend, a neighbor, an intimate partner when we're talking about domestic violence. You know, this is somebody that I really love and care about, and it's supposed to love me back. And so when we see, you know, hurt and pain that comes up in the context of that close relationship where there's trust and safety that's supposed to be there, that becomes threatened, it becomes much more complicated to move through that because then we start associating the pain with the love. So it kind of gets a little bit blurry and mixed up and hard to sort through, as compared with well, and some other things that I'll talk about with those dynamics are, you know, sometimes the dynamics, you know, a lot of times we call them power and control dynamics that happen in the context of those relationships where the victim in that situation feels helpless, they feel fearful, you know, they may not really know how to get out, they may start blaming themselves, this is my fault that this is happening, and so those kind of power and control dynamics keep the person in that situation. So the trauma may be ongoing, last for a long time. Again, the person may feel helpless and fearful, whereas something like, say, like a car accident or something like that may be more like a one-time event. It's not really associated with someone that we develop love and care and trust for and connection for, and it may be sometimes more of an isolated situation that may be still impactful, right, but it may not be as complicated for me to move through because those different dynamics aren't there.
So it adds a lot of complicated layers to it for somebody in their thoughts, their beliefs, their emotions, their perceptions of other possible future relationships because of the really close nature between them and really the source of the trauma, which is maybe different from a car accident unless it was intentional, but or a natural disaster where there's maybe it's accidental or there's no real cause. But to just the complications of trying to figure out how somebody that's close to you could do something like that for you.
Exactly.
So for any trauma, and especially thinking about domestic violence or child abuse or any sort of abuse experiences in the context of a close relationship, what are some of the ways that a person who has experienced some sort of trauma, pretty generally, might find that playing out in a future romantic relationship especially? Yeah,
well, I think the first thing that comes out from me is that, you know, there can be a lot of fear about entering a new relationship, and so there may be a lot of fear and apprehension, hesitation, you know, around the fact of, can I trust this person, right? Can I feel safe with this person? Is this person really going to be there for me? Can I be myself with this person? Is this person going to criticize me, blame me, make me feel like things are my fault? And so there's a real kind of hesitation or reluctance, I think, that sometimes goes with entering into new relationships with people that, you know, haven't done anything to us. And no one's perfect, so we can't necessarily predict, right, how a relationship will turn out, right? But we might be much more tentative, or folks that have a history of trauma may interpret things that their new partner or new person in that relationship or friendship may do as abusive, when maybe it's actually not, and it's just a part of a normal functioning of a healthy relationship. So being able to kind of tease out, you know, what's abusive, what's not abusive, what's healthy, what's not healthy, can be really difficult for that person who has that past history to really determine, because they may have been entrenched in a really unhealthy pattern with someone for a long time and may just not know how to, you know, how to navigate that the best way that they can.
Well, and you mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder earlier, and I think a lot of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which of course not everybody who experiences a trauma will develop post-traumatic stress disorder, but if you think about a lot of the symptoms, how they could play out, the hypervigilance,
absolutely,
like you mentioned, they might be interpreting things. So if their experiences of an abusive relationship, they might be really watching every single thing and very alert, and also just the sort of triggering and the re-experiencing. So it might not be abusive in a new relationship. It could be, but it may not be. And so, but there might be a certain feeling that might get triggered, or this reminds me of something that happened in the context, and so that it could certainly heighten some of the emotional responses to the relationship dynamics too. And the other one I'll add too is also avoidance too. It's one of the common symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So maybe avoiding close relationships altogether, or part of what you said made me think about really someone might really have a guard up in the relationship, so they want to be in a relationship, but they want to keep that person at arm's length, because they're just avoiding the potential of being so close.
And really that's out of protection for them. They don't want to experience that same pain again. You know, I'm thinking about, you know, if you're a child abuse survivor, maybe there was a sexual assault or something, or sexual abuse, right? You know, may avoid, you know, wanting to be intimate with your partner, you know, in a physical way, or again, like you said, that emotional barrier of what it means to be vulnerable, to be, you know, to share with my partner out of fear, or again, that avoidance of, you know, I don't want to experience that again, so let me pull this wall up. But then that, you know, can become problematic in that new relationship that you're in. And so these are all, like you said, symptoms of post-traumatic stress: the hypervigilance, you know, the avoidance, the maybe more intense emotional reactions that we may have, you know, based on these triggers that sometimes happen in the context of these new relationships.
And I think that was a really important point that you just made about that they're protective. And so we definitely don't want to think about people as damaged or problematic because these things are happening, but they really do serve, from a strength-based perspective, they really do serve a protective function. The person is maybe using some of those strategies to protect themselves or to keep themselves safe when they felt unsafe in past situations. But definitely they can be things that can really play out in a new relationship that can cause challenges for that relationship. And as the partners are really working toward building a connection, all of these things can potentially come up and cause more distance in that relationship.
Absolutely, which can be very frustrating. If one, you don't even know what's going on. So as a person with a traumatic history, you know, sometimes the person really doesn't, like, why am I having these reactions? Like, what is going on? Am I going crazy? Right? There can be a lot of stigma attached to, you know, why is this happening to me? Why can't I just function normally? So there maybe can be a lack of education or awareness around, actually, this is normal. And so then how do I become aware of that and then begin to, you know, take the steps to navigate through that? You know, and the partner's experience of that as well. You know, how do I respond and react to what's happening in my relationship, because I want to have a good relationship. So,
so let's talk a little more about some of those dynamics of what each partner might then bring into the relationship. So let's start by thinking about a relationship where one person has a history of trauma and the other person maybe doesn't have
Okay.
at least a very significant experience of trauma. And so what are some of the unique needs or experiences that somebody may bring in to a relationship? What do they need going into that relationship for it to be healthy for them?
Yeah, I think the main things that stand out for me in the research and experiences that we've done are the person needs to feel safe. They need understanding, they need patience, and they need someone to feel, they need to feel like their partner supports them, is empathic, is non-judgmental, you know, just really that emotional support, because it will be difficult, and there's no guarantee that my triggers will end, you know, at any point in the relationship. And so the partner will need to be able to respond to that. First, understand and accept that. You know, that partner may need to you know, to do some education on their own or for themselves about trauma and what's happened to their partner, so that they can understand and be able to provide that patience and understanding and support for their partner as they're navigating through that relationship. The experiences kind of that we talked about before, about kind of being hesitant in the relationship and maybe avoiding things and things like that, those are the types of experiences that, you know, like you said, may play out in the context of that relationship. And it may be difficult to know how to navigate that. And so the extent to which that partner may need to get additional support will be something that has to be communicated sometimes as well.
And so definitely having a supportive partner is something that anybody would need in an intimate relationship, whether they have an experience of trauma or not, but really having somebody who is there to support them, who, as you said, patience, understands that they may not just get over it in a day, and that's not an unrealistic expectation, but to be able to understand that there might be some long-term lasting effects, and just really creating a very safe environment, which again, that's one of the really core elements of a healthy relationship for anybody, but especially if somebody has a history of unsafe experiences or unsafe trauma-related experiences, the need for that is even greater.
Yes, it is even stronger. Yeah, and so the extent to the partner who has the past trauma history may need, you know, reminders and reinforcements of, you know, is this relationship safe? Are you safe for me? And how can that partner respond to that and reinforce that and remind that person, you know, you are safe, right? This is not the past. This is the present. And be just really understanding, non-judgmental, and supportive of that partner through that experience.
So let's take a question that we've gotten through the chat room.
Okay.
Yes. So how can the partner of a person who has experienced trauma support them through challenging family dynamics? For example, when the partner suffered child abuse but still has a relationship with the former abuser.
That's a really difficult one. I think, you know, the partner may really want to step in and say, you know, can you just end this relationship? Can we get some distance? Can we, you know, can we separate from this at all, right? Why are you continuing to put yourself through this? And I think, you know, it's really important to be able for both partners to communicate with one another, and to be able to work through that the best way that they can work through it. Because yes, sometimes we do have these kind of messy dynamics where, you know, I may have a child with my ex-partner, or I may have a family member who was abusive to me that's still in my life that maybe no one knows what happened, or maybe nothing has been done. And so that can be, you know, really hard to navigate. I think that you have to be aware and true to yourself about what you can tolerate, you know, and what you can accept. You know, maybe the person who, you know, is the partner is trying to support, maybe it's becoming too stressful and overwhelming for them to be able to manage that, because it's simply too unhealthy for them. And sometimes making those choices for ourselves are sometimes what we need to do, and also to be fully informed about, you know, if this is a person that I want to be with and support with, given what the situation is and what we may or may not be able to do about it. So I think you have to be very clear for yourself and what you can handle and what you can't. And sometimes it's okay to say, you know, this is too much for me, and, you know, how can you best support your partner? Sometimes that's asking them for what they need versus you stepping in and saying, this is what needs to happen.
Yeah,
so it's balancing that. It's very complicated. Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that is a very complicated experience for people if they have to have ongoing relationships. I think, like you said, the example in the question was about a parent who was abusive, but like you said, there's other dynamics where if they share a child with somebody who abused them, they might have ongoing sort of custody and parenting concerns. And so I think you're right that it's a lot about finding out, for the partner to really find out what do they want, how are they coping with that situation, because there might be certain things that they're doing that are self-protective already, or there might be certain things that they need, or they may be doing things that look like they don't make sense, but they know that if they tried it the other way, then it might set off that person, for example. So there might be, you know, sort of really having a lot of open communication about how you're handling the situation, what you need, trying not to be judgmental. But I think you raised some really good points, too, about for the partner that they might need to set some boundaries. And they may need to figure out what is healthy for them, or if there's too high a level of stress, then it's okay for them to also express what they need in that situation too, if they're finding it to be really stressful. Maybe they don't want to be part of those experiences or family visits back home. It's too uncomfortable for them. So it's really, I don't think there's any, in a lot of these types of situations, there's not any one way to handle it, because the dynamics are so variable in terms of what those situations can look like. But again, it just brings back to the importance of a lot of good communication, potentially going to a counselor to really work through some of that, because it sounds like that type of situation would have a lot of ongoing dynamics.
Absolutely, and to speak up and really be clear and aware of what you need, because everyone has needs and wants. Both partners, whether or not one has an abusive past or another, and both of those needs and wants are valid, right? And so how do we, like you said, engage in that healthy communication where both partners are able to express that, and hopefully, you know, able to come to a compromise that both partners can feel good about, right? Because what we don't want to happen is, you know, for one partner to feel resentful of the other, or, you know, now it's an issue with us. You know, you've experienced this past trauma with a family member, but now it's bringing into our relationship, which we want to minimize as much as possible. And so as much as we can have that ongoing communication, and if we need help and support, right, it's okay to step out and to get that professional help, because it's complicated, and sometimes it's difficult to navigate on your own. And what works for one couple may not work for you, and vice versa. And so not getting caught up in comparing, you know, what we should be doing, or ideas of what other people are doing, and, you know, we're not doing that. And so, focusing on what works best for you and your relationship.
And so let's talk a little bit more about partners of somebody who's experienced trauma, because we've already touched on this a little bit with that question, but what might be some challenges or difficult to understand experiences that somebody may have if they're in a relationship with somebody who has experienced a trauma? What's it look like from their perspective?
Yeah, I think it can just look like, you know, we were talking about some of those more active trauma symptoms before. You know, why is this person getting so emotionally overwhelmed? You know, maybe a lot of crying, or maybe that person doesn't open up and talk as much about certain things, or why is this person avoiding sex or being intimate together? These are some of the things that we can start to see. Why does this person avoid this particular restaurant or this place I just want to be able to go and enjoy, but it seems like these triggers that we were talking about earlier manifest themselves in the current relationship, when perhaps nothing to the partner, and the partner's perspective, nothing is happening. We're safe, we're fine, and then sometimes, you know, it can be suddenly that something may come up and disrupt what's happening in the moment, and that may be very difficult for that other partner to understand.
So it sounds like there might be a lot of confusion for them, or just sort of questions, why is this happening? And and so it seems like one really important thing for them to be able to do would be to, again, communicate, asking questions rather than making assumptions or maybe getting frustrated, but to be curious and be respectfully asking about that. So what are some other things that a partner can do to offer helpful support to their partner who has a history of trauma?
Yeah, I think along with the ongoing communication, like you said, in a respectful way, in a non-judgmental way, in a non-blaming way, you know, sometimes that partner may need, you know, these really clear messages around that you are safe, and that, you know, those constant reminders of what it means to be safe in that current relationship. We talked a little bit about counseling a little bit before, but sometimes it can be helpful, you know, if that partner were to recommend going to counseling together, either for that partner individually or together. You know, being open to the process of getting help and support from others, versus feeling like, you know, I'm obligated, or, you know, I really don't want to go, or, you know, having resentment or something like that. Are some other options that supportive partner can do, and just really asking for, I think it all comes back to communication a lot of the times, like asking for what that person needs, right? And asking and actually being willing and receptive to be able to engage in that with them.
It sounds like it also would take a lot of self-awareness on both people's
Yeah.
parts to some extent, so that the person who has experienced the trauma is able to recognize their emotional responses, some of the reactions that they've had, and be able to communicate that. It seems like it would be harder to communicate if they didn't have as much self-awareness around that. And I think the same thing could be said for, in a different way, for the partner.
Right. And not taking things, another thing that's coming up for me is the partner not taking it personal, which I think sometimes can feel like a very, you know, personal attack, or, you know, is it me, or, and that can be very confusing. And so the more that they are able to get educated, and like you said, become more aware about not only what the person has experienced individually, but, you know, what is trauma? Like, what is this thing? How can I educate myself even on trauma and post-traumatic stress and things like that? So at least it makes sense to me, so that maybe I don't take some of these dynamics personally, and, you know, as a personal attack or something that I'm doing wrong, which I think partners who have abusive histories can sometimes get caught in and feel just very discouraged and, you know, and down about. So.
Yeah, it can be hard to sort out what is the personal reaction from trying to understand what the person's going through, and really getting a sense of why they're making the choices.
Very complicated.
So we have another question that's come in.
We do. How can you support a partner with a history of trauma if the partner isn't aware that their experience was traumatic or denies it? Also, if they aren't aware that they're showing signs of this trauma in the relationship.
Yeah, I think that's also a really hard one. I think the partner and their attempts to try to support, I think being as delicate and concrete with their examples of what they're actually experiencing. So a lot of times what we talk about in couples therapy is using I language and I statements. So, you know, I'm observing that I'm experiencing this whenever this is happening in our relationship. And so I'm wondering a little bit more about that. You know, the partner being willing to, again, in a non-blaming way, express how they're experiencing the other partner, right? Is this a pattern? Is this something consistent that we're, you know, that's showing up in our relationship? And, you know, to the extent that you do encourage your partner to become more aware about this, and whether or not they are willing to seek counseling or additional support or not, you know, you can't force someone to get help. You can't control necessarily another person's behavior. You just can't. And so speaking to your experience, I think sometimes will make the partner maybe less defensive, or maybe start to become a little bit more aware about what's happening, because they don't feel blamed or attacked necessarily, because the partner is speaking about their own experience and what they're observing. But I think our delivery and how we share that information plays a huge role, right? Because if we're blaming or being critical or condescending or, you know, mean, you know, about what's happening, that's only going to raise my wall up even more. And so our tone, our pitch, when we talk about it, are we talking about it in the heat of the moment versus when things are calm and, you can deliver your message in a supportive way that the partner can really hear you. I think those are sometimes dynamics that we underestimate and that we may not always think through about, how we communicate these things.
Yeah, it's definitely not healthy for anybody to feel like they constantly need to walk on eggshells around their partner. And so typically if I'm thinking about walking on eggshells in a traumatic relationship context, I'm thinking about somebody who feels like they need to walk on eggshells by somebody who is abusive. But to see it playing out the other way in this situation of somebody who's in a safe, healthy, non-abusive relationship, but like the question said, if somebody's showing things that could be directly related to a past experience of trauma, but the partner who's afraid to mention it, or who's not sure how they're going to react, but that's not a healthy situation for that partner to be in either, to feel like they can't express their wants and needs in the context of that relationship. But I definitely think you're exactly right that how that conversation is brought up definitely could be something that would be helpful to address with the help of a counselor to sort through it. But I think it's always just at a real super practical level a good idea to just say something like, I'm concerned about you, or I feel, as you said, the I statements, I feel frustrated when I bring this concern to you, and it seems to me like your reaction is bigger than what the situation actually calls for. And of course, those statements can come across as very blaming, judgmental, especially for somebody who does have a history of trauma and that's playing out for them. So I think just treating it with a lot of sensitivity and being very cautious in those statements, but also being open about it and being direct, because definitely I think that if you are in a relationship and you feel that your partner needs healing, and the fact that they are lacking healing in a certain area of their life is really impacting the relationship, is something that ultimately would need to be addressed, but in a very positive, supportive environment. And really also I would say approach it as a team too. I think nobody likes to be sort of told, you're the problem,
you need to fix it,
you need to fix it, but you just say, it seems like we could work together to work on better handling some of these conflict dynamics. And even if it doesn't get immediately to the trauma, just to potentially sort of start working together, build that positive relationship, and it may be as the couple moves more along in the process, then it becomes more and more clear that there's those past experiences that are rearing their ugly head, but really building a safe context for doing that. And also for the partner to really keep in mind that part of the reason that they might not be sharing or be open or be putting the pieces together, that there might be some effects of the trauma, might have to do with the fact that maybe they don't feel totally safe in that relationship. And that may not be because of anything the partner's doing, it just might be because they have a hard time feeling safe in the context of relationships. So just really, I would say, especially the last thing that I'll say about that, I think the more that they focus on strengthening the relationship in general, building more trust, having more positive experiences in communication, and then as that stronger foundation is built, that's the place to then potentially start having those deeper conversations.
And I think to your point, like, even starting the conversation with, I love you, I care about you, I'm concerned about some of the things that I'm seeing, and I want to move through this together with you, if that's something that that person is authentically feeling. I think that can just, shift the tone and, you said, set that positive tone, that strengths-based tone that we can then move forward in working through those concerns together.
And I think that this really ties to our next topic, which is about recovery and what that looks like in the context of couple relationships. And we know that there's a lot of stereotypes about people who've experienced trauma. There's often a thought they're damaged or they're somehow, sort of forever broken by those experiences. But we know from our research and our work with survivors that people can recover, they can triumph over their abuse, they can go on to build healthy lives. And so what are some of the important things for people to understand about recovery from abuse, and especially in the context of a couple relationship?
Absolutely. Well, this is probably the area that I'm most excited to talk about, because this has a lot to do with my research. But I think one of the main things that I think is important to know is that it's intentional, right? There is a timing element. You know, we know the old saying of, you know, time heals all wounds and things of that nature. And to some extent that is true. We know that it does take time to heal. And I think that there are some intentional things that survivors of past trauma can be aware that may help them in that process. And so we've obviously talked about counseling. And in the research that I've done, it's very, very evident of survivors who have engaged in this research that say, right, that getting that professional emotional help and support is critical. This is something that happens to many people, and it's also something that, you know, unfortunately, sometimes we feel like we have to deal with it alone, and that's simply not the case. And so being able to talk to someone who, first of all, has the training to do so, you know, who doesn't have a say-so in your life necessarily, right? It's not a family member, it's not a friend, someone who's completely non-attached to what your experience has been and can offer you that perspective, can give you that education, right, on trauma. We know that learning about trauma and getting that psychoeducation about what's happened to you can play a huge role, right, in normalizing first of all, what you've gone through, and maybe what are some of the symptoms that you continue to experience can be extremely powerful for someone. I'm not alone in this. This is actually a real thing that happens that can be extremely healing. You know, and in that, sometimes in those situations where we are connecting with the resources, we meet other people who have also experienced the same thing, and we get excited to share our story and to get involved and advocating for other people who have been through what we've been through. We know that that's something that is very helpful. The extent that we can connect with other people in a healthy way. So, you know, sometimes whenever we experience trauma, you know, we've isolated ourselves from our friends, from our family. Sometimes we have to rebuild our support system. Support is huge in the healing process because a lot of times we feel that we've been alone for so long. And so when we're able to connect with other people, it's very, very, very important in that healing. I'm trying to think of some other things too. Sometimes survivors talk about engaging in some type of spiritual practice, whether that's meditation or getting more in touch with their faith, with their religion, can sometimes be very empowering as well. Sometimes what comes through the counseling and experience and healing is developing a new sense of purpose and meaning in the person's life. Maybe they've put off school, or, you know, they're discovering what career opportunities may be available for them, and, you know, getting back to the things that they used to love and care about, their skills, their talents, their strengths. And maybe some of that is, you know, they're still learning that. Maybe they don't know, and so that's really an opportunity for you to begin to explore the things that make you happy, give you meaning, give you purpose, and, you know, really be intentional about pursuing that as a way to heal from what's happened to you. So those are some of the things that I think are really critical for healing and for growth and for recovery, is that it's intentional, it's gradual, so you may not be able to do all of those things, you know, in one day, so it does take time. But these are some of the things that we know that when they intentionally happen in a supportive way, then that really contributes to the person being able to heal.
And I think everybody's healing journey will look different, and the things that are helpful for them. And so you mentioned a lot of different pieces like counseling, support groups, rediscovering themselves, a spiritual element to it. So everybody, it might look different, but I think that the key is that it's important to heal. And what can happen for people is if they've had some sort of major traumatic experience and they haven't at least begun the healing journey or recognized the need for healing, that can really play out in future relationships, and potentially they're maybe just not ready for that relationship.
Absolutely.
And if somebody's already in a relationship, it's definitely not too late, because the healing can still happen.
Absolutely.
So we have a question on this topic.
What does the research say about the impact of childhood sexual abuse on men versus women?
Well, first of all, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is that a lot of times we don't even consider the fact that men could have a sexual abuse history. So first of all, in terms of what it says in the research, we know that in terms of what's reported, right, that we see that a lot of more stats right around women. But we can also have that experience, men can also have that experience just as much. The problem is that it's not talked about. It's not researched as often, I would say, Dr. Murray, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because men aren't willing to speak on it and report it and really talk about it. So sometimes it's, we may not know the effects that it has on men as much as women, but I would probably guess that it's very similar. But maybe it's not something that's as widely accepted or known, or there's a lot more stigma around it as compared to, it being a more normal experience that a lot of women may have. And so, I think, again, that communication becomes so much more important whenever you're seeing triggers or things that are showing up in the relationship. So when we're talking about an intimate relationship or sexual relationship, right, being able to notice and being aware, right, of your female partner or your male partner's reactions, right, whenever you're being intimate, and, being able to speak on that. And again, in a way that's not stigmatizing and judgmental, and in knowing that, especially if it's a male partner, that process may be even more difficult, right? Because there's all different, much more layers of stigma maybe that are on that. Maybe they were abused by a male partner, right? So there may be implications that, the partner may feel like maybe they're gay or something like that. And, if that's not the case, right, that can be very, very embarrassing or distressful, or discouraging to talk about at all. So
it can be
understanding that,
for them to talk about it,
absolutely,
possibly because of all these layers of stigma. But I think that the other piece to add to that is that the most important thing would be to really ask them, what does it mean to you to be a man who has experienced this abuse? Or same thing as a woman, and how does gender play out for them? Because, again, that's something, there's so many different ways that can look with those experiences, and maybe talking about what does this mean for you in terms of how you view your masculinity or your femininity, if we're talking about a female. And so really just sort of putting it into that broader context of, again, the communication and trying to understand what that unique experience was like for that person. Right.
And sometimes, and again, to your point earlier, is that everyone's experience is unique. So we may, automatically assume, like the language that you were using earlier around being damaged. I may have experienced a sexual abuse, as a child, as an adult, or whatever, and maybe it hasn't really impacted me in the ways that we may think or that we may assume, or, or things of that nature, and maybe it does have a really big impact on me. And so, like you said, being able to communicate, what is that unique experience for you, right, and how does that play out in our relationship? And it may look, like you said, very, very different depending on each individual person.
And so we're kind of moving toward the end of our time, so if there's any other questions, be sure to submit those soon, and we should have time to probably take one or two more questions. But before we do that, I wanted to ask another question, which is that some people, if they have a past history of trauma, especially domestic violence or child abuse, they actually make the choice not to have future romantic relationships. And is that a healthy choice?
Yeah, well, I think, the traditional answer in our field is it depends. I think it really depends on the person. I think that, to a little bit of our conversation earlier, self-awareness, intentional healing, and really being authentic in your choices and your decisions about what you want to do with your life. Ultimately it's your life, and you can decide. You're the only person that can truly decide what decision is best for you. And so if you feel that you've really been intentional about making that decision about not to pursue, another romantic relationship, that's perfectly fine. You feel good about that, you've done a really intentional healing and growth, and you feel very aware and really true and authentic inside about, yes, this is that decision that's going to be best for me. Absolutely go with it.
It can be a healthy decision.
Absolutely.
And I would say at the same time, I think it's probably a good idea to keep at least some level of an open mind.
Yes.
Because it may be that that's a decision forever, or it might be a decision that there's just a period of time where they want to take time on their own. We've heard from a lot of survivors of domestic violence who say they just needed some time on their own to rediscover themselves and reconnect with their interests and potentially move towards a different career path or educational goals. And so maybe it's something that is maybe it is a decision forever, and if it's something like you're saying that they come to, then it certainly can be a healthy choice. But it also could be something that they might change their mind on later.
Absolutely.
And so that also can be a healthy part of their process
Absolutely.
too.
And knowing, like, you know, am I ruling this out of fear? You know, I don't deserve to be, you know, in a relationship, and am I too scared? This is going to happen again, right? Is that is what's preventing you? And if that's still the case right now, that's perfectly fine too, right? But knowing that, you know, connection is still something that, you know, a lot of people want and deserve to have a safe and happy and healthy relationship. And so if that's something that you really truly do want, there are ways to work towards that, and that you can have that if that's something that you really want. And if you're aware of some of the things that from the past are still getting in the way of that, how do you work through that intentionally so that you can build those safe and happy relationships in the future, because you absolutely deserve that if that's something that you want.
Do we have any other questions?
Not necessarily right
Okay, all right, great. Well, we can actually close with one final question, which is, what are your big picture suggestions for, as we look at all that we've talked about today, how best can somebody support a partner who has a history of trauma? What are some of the key things that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, well, I think, again, I think I've said this before, being patient, knowing that things take time. I think that we've really hit the nail on the head in terms of communication, right? Speak up to what your needs and wants are in the relationship. You deserve to be heard, and you deserve to be listened to. And, you know, everyone's experience in the relationship is valid. So, you know, just because I may not have gone through a past trauma doesn't mean that I don't have the right to speak up and ask for what I need and for what I want. Then the same person who's experienced that trauma as well, right? The way in which we communicate, I think, is something to be really aware of. How can we be non-judgmental, patient, understanding, empathic, and supportive, I think, are some of the really, you know, things that stand out. And being intentional. You don't have to do it alone, right? You can get support. There are people that are here that are very passionate, that are trained, and that, you know, want to help. And that, you know, we talk about a lot of times the stigma around seeking help and support of, you know, well, we can just deal with it, or, you know, we can just wait, maybe it'll get better, and things of that nature. And so don't wait. You know, get that help and support that you need so that you can be happy and healthy sooner in your relationship. So those are the things that stand out.
Yeah, and I like how you talked about really being intentional. And of course, every couple needs to be intentional about building a healthy relationship. But especially if you know that your partner has that experience of some sort of trauma that's still impacting them today, really especially be intentional about fostering a sense of safety in that relationship, and work together with your partner to figure out what does that look like, how can you both really create a safe environment for each other and for the relationship to really grow and flourish, and support one another through that. And really, some marriage and couples therapists really believe that actually a lot of healing occurs in the context of that close relationship. So definitely, we're not saying at all today that you need to be 100% fully healed to be able to have a healthy relationship. Probably nobody could have a healthy relationship if that was true, because everybody is carrying some sort of
we all have
past
things.
experiences. But to really look at that relationship and think, how can we create this really supportive, healing, helpful, loving context for this relationship?
Absolutely, yeah. We call that a corrective emotional experience, and you know, and that is relational because it's a relationship. And so whenever you had a past history and then you're able to experience something very corrective with someone else, can be extremely powerful, whether or not you end up being with that person for forever or not, because you're able to have a different experience than the one that you've had before, which is really powerful.
And so one final takeaway that you want to share that you hope people who are with us today will walk away with.
One final takeaway. You deserve to be loved and feel safe and supported and connected with other people. And so don't ever let anyone else tell you that you don't. There is a way and a path to healing. It takes time. Go by your own clock, not anyone else's, and be intentional.
Great. Yeah, great final thoughts for us, definitely. And so we do hope that today's topic was helpful for everybody. Whether you yourself have experienced a trauma or your partner has, probably you know somebody. Most likely you certainly do know somebody who's experienced some sort of traumatic experience and it's impacting them in their relationships. And so we always want to think about how we can foster healthy, safe, supportive relationships. So I just really appreciate all that you've shared with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to everybody for being here today. We hope that what you learned today will be helpful for you in your own relationships. We do welcome your feedback, and Camilla is going to post the link for our feedback form in the chat room, and we invite everybody to please take a moment to fill that out before signing off for today. And we also invite you to check back for our next Relationship Boosters. The next one we have coming up is on Friday, April 18th, and also at noon. And the topic for that one is going to be about getting your team to talk with you. So we thank you so much for being with us today, and we hope that it's helpful in building happy, healthy, and safe relationships in your own life.